Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 9th, 2024. I was privileged to have been a participant in a weekend conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute this last weekend, which served as a platform for wise and impassioned discussions about a way out of the crises which are engulfing the planet. The kind of dialogues which took place are an example of what Helga Zepp-LaRouche called for when she said we need a council of reason, of mature adults to discuss the world situation, as opposed to the agents of corporate cartels, the military-industrial complex, and the war hawks who have tended to dominate most international fora. So I'm going to include in the description section today links to panel 1. And over subsequent days, I'll include the other panels. Speakers on the first panel included top officials from Russia and China, 2 former heads of state, 2 prominent military veterans who served in the government, namely Scott Ritter and Colonel Larry Wilkerson, a leading U.S. former diplomat, Chaz Freeman, all in dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. When I say this was extraordinary, it was the kind of deliberative process that should be taking place in institutions, but is blocked by the power of the corporate cartels operating through their strangleholds on Western governments. Now, this event occurred as the 40th anniversary of the Schiller Institute, which took upon itself the responsibility back in 1984 to provide a bridge between Europe and the United States. Now that bridge today is totally dominated by neocons and neoliberals and war hawks. And so it's important that the Schiller Institute represents an alternative which has a voice which is rebounding around the world. Now, the idea of a council of reason is that you need to have voices that operate outside of the bubble of the corporate cartels and the media, the controlled media. So if you're pessimistic about the state of the world, and there are certainly reasons to be so, set aside some time the next couple of days to watch the first panel. And as I said, the rest will come over the course of the week. Now, this conference occurred as there were dramatic events unfolding in Syria, which I'm sure you've at least heard some of it. As of the moment, there's much that we don't know, other than the fact that the president of Syria, al-Assad, was given asylum in Moscow with his family. He left Syria. There was a lightning offensive by the so-called rebels, and the other aspects of where things are going to go are very unpredictable. But I'm going to present to you something that was presented by Chaz Freeman in an interview this morning, early this morning, with a podcaster, which I think several of the points he made are absolutely on target. He said on the collapse of the Syrian army, you can't ignore the effects of the Caesar sanctions imposed by the United States. This crippled the government. It meant they couldn't afford food. They couldn't afford energy. There are blackouts every single day in Syria. In fact, many people have electricity only 2 to 4 hours a day. The army is poorly funded as a result of this. Now, further, he said, don't forget that the U.S. is controlling the oil and gas fields in Syria, so that the potential revenue from that, or even access to the petroleum, is not available to the Syrian government. Add to that the Israeli assault on Hezbollah, which is one of the supporters of the Syrian government, the bombing by Israel of targets in Syria, and the Israeli attacks on Iran, which is one of the defenders and supporters of Syria. This shows why the government was not able to hold on. There's also a Turkish role. This is not totally clear because the Turks have their own incentives. Namely, they want to destroy the PKK Kurdish forces, and at the same time, they'd like to return 5 million Syrian refugees to Syria. There's obviously a NATO role, and this has to be explored. This includes Ukrainian technical aid in the form of drones, maybe even presence among the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham forces from Ukraine. But they turned this from a guerrilla rebel outfit into a well-equipped, well-trained army. How about CIA involvement? Well, we know from the past that the CIA has been involved in regime change efforts in Syria since at least 1947, Freeman reported, and that these were very prominent in the post-2011 insurgency in Syria to overthrow the Assad government. Finally, there's a whole question, as I mentioned, of NATO. Macron was crowing his delight. Remember, the French from the pre-World War I period, or actually World War I period, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the French were given the mandate, and after the League of Nations, after World War I, the legal mandate over Syria and Lebanon. And it's clear that there was probably a French role in this as well. So you put all this together, and what you see is the Israeli, U.S., NATO combined efforts with the idea that this will weaken Russia, will harm its prestige, at a point at which Russia is clearly winning the war in Ukraine. And we see NATO pressing ahead. We see Joe Biden providing more money to Ukraine. This is the continuation of a war which cannot be won. Why keep funding hundreds of billions of U.S. taxpayers' dollars that's leading to the destruction of a nation that puts us on the edge of war with Russia, which has all of Europe on edge? We've seen the collapse of the French government, the collapse of the German government. We see the emergence of so-called right-wing nationalist forces in Slovakia, in Romania, probably coming up soon in Czechia, in Germany, in Austria. The so-called center, to the extent that it's been taken over by the war hawks, doesn't hold anymore. And so in this polarization, we see a danger of war, which Scott Ritter has repeatedly pointed out could be a nuclear war by accident at any moment. Now, if you doubt the intent of this, listen to the words of Admiral Thomas Buchanan, the Director of Plans and Policy of the U.S. Strategic Command. In other words, the guy who has his finger on the nuclear button. We know Biden doesn't know what he's doing with it, but here's what Buchanan said just a couple weeks ago at a conference held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a leading Washington think tank. Buchanan said the U.S. would allow a nuclear exchange if the outcome was on terms that would be acceptable to the U.S., and that the U.S. held on to a large enough nuclear stockpile after the exchange to ensure its continued hegemonic status. That's the statement of the head of Strategic Command. It brings to question why this has not been more widely publicized, but secondly, why has this guy not been fired or relieved of duty? Oh yeah, I forgot. We don't have a president. So it's in this context that the deliberation of the Schiller Institute takes on outsized importance, because there's no one else in the world providing this kind of platform for dialogue. And I urge people to join us, subscribe to our publications, sign up for a Schiller Institute membership. Go to schillerinstitute.com and you can do that. So watch the proceedings. I was the moderator of the fourth panel, the last one yesterday, on the civilization and culture, which was a very stimulating discussion. So as I said, I'll be posting this during the week. Let's take a deep breath and make sure that those of us who are of sound mind and reasonable capabilities, that we intrude ourselves on the bubble of the media and the censorship complex and make sure that our fellow citizens have access to this kind of discussion.